This channel is supported by Truefire. Truefire is an online library
enough. You can get the Truefire All Access Pass for as cheap as they ever do it, the $99 thing. So just jump and do that if you're looking for the best price you can get Truefire All Access for.
Okay, I was flicking by some stuff the other day and I saw an article that had come up. John Mayer talking about something, and I thought it was actually a fairly wise point, which you may or may not agree with, or you may or may not have tried. And his general point was that guitar neck radius doesn't matter as much as strap height, essentially, because he was saying, like, if the guitar frets are leveled well, then you can play on pretty much any radius, and I guess John Mayer has a vested interest in this as someone whose signature guitars are 7.25 inch radius here on the core model, and then the SE I think is like 8.25 inches. So both on the vintage end of things. But if you've never tried this, I did do a video on this, like, I can't remember, recently-ish, because I'd had literally actually Paul had spoken to me, not that Paul Toop, a soundman who has a firearms license. But yes, so if he tells you to turn down, you do. He put on my PRS Silver Sky on a gig, and he went, "Oh, that's really nice." And then he kind of said, "Actually, I didn't realise what a difference strap height made to how your guitar feels." And so if you've been someone who's like, I can't take it off here, but like, I've done a video literally talking about it, where it's like, if you feel the difference of a guitar that's, I should do it with this one because I can take this strap off easily. If you try doing like the Billy Joe Armstrong thing, is that his name? Blink 182 type thing as well, or Green Day or whoever. Well, basically, like, just look at your arm position, like your wrist. If you're playing up here, John Mayer actually is one of the guys that actually does manage to play with a very low strap. But yeah, you imagine like a difference. He's saying just going up one strap button can change a guitar feel more than... And he's right, I think. Anyway, so in this video I wanted to sort of get into that a little bit more, and look at what it is about these radiuses that online we kind of feel like I read all the time that bending is harder on a vintage Radius guitar, that they'll choke out more, and you know, for example, like Andy Wood, we chatted because he'd done, is it Carter Vintage or Groon's guitars? It was one of like the really posh places in America. He'd done a demo playing a vintage Radius guitar, and I loved it. And then I saw his signature guitar in Project Music near me, and I picked it up. I think that might be like a 16-inch Radius, but for me, I prefer the vintage Radius. And with me and Andy were chatting about it, and he was like, "Oh, I can't stand the vintage Radius." So like, this is intensely personal for everyone. But I do feel like, for me personally, I prefer, so my K-line's like a 10-inch radius, this is 7.25-inch radius. For me, I'm quite happy with 10 and under as being like my kind of starting point. I should also say that I'm someone who quite likes a medium, maybe slightly higher action. And I think that might be part of it, because that's one thing for me with lower action guitars. I feel like, the bends and like the string feel and vibrato is just, for whatever reason, tougher. One good idea to try a thing to figure out whether the guitar is set up sufficiently, and I guess this would be with any radius of frets, right? Would be to see if you could do the Gilmour. Another brick in the wall, double bend. So, you know, this guitar is doing nothing but encourage bends. I also feel like, for some reason, to me, like, the vintage Radius feels kind of softer in the hands, and so when I go to do a bend, it's just more encouraging. And the feeling that I get with a flatter Radius is that I'm actually pushing up, like, sort of trying to climb a wall. Does that make sense to anyone else? I guess part of what else might be going on with this guitar is that typically, if it's got a vintage Radius, it's probably going to have a slightly thicker neck in general, and I don't know whether that helps with bending too. Because naturally your hand position is a bit more open. But it's just like a bit of a cautionary. I do have one other vintage Radius guitar here, right? And it's not to say that this is an easy thing to get right for your tech. So this is slightly lower action. And that feels harder. Another thing that makes a huge difference to the feel of bending, I think more than Radius again, is your trem. Like, is that decked or floating? Because with a lot of trems, what you'll find is as you bend, that starts to pull down, and then you've got to bend more. You've got to keep going to sort of compensate for the trem sort of slackening. I think one of the things, again, that they say about these flatter radius guitars, so this is a Sterling Kaizen, which I really love for a bunch of other things, but, and like they say this about Strandberg, and bits and pieces, is just things like the bends are easier. Now I don't know why that would be. So I could do the whole step. But the two. This is another thing actually, which I think might be way more important. Again, still, I think there's just a bunch of other things that are way more important than the radius. I think the bigger the frets, the easier this bending thing can feel if they're like nicely done. That is a thing. Smaller frets to me under the hands feel a little bit scratchier potentially, or a bit more delicate or whatever. But one thing that I do think helps is having a slightly higher action, so that your finger doesn't sort of just like roll over the top of the string, and it feels like you're kind of getting the string a little bit under this and it's kind of lifting. But definitely I don't feel like I can play any more accurately on a I don't know, like to me it's not cut and dry that a modern feeling guitar is any better suited to some of this stuff as I try and do it, and maybe I just don't shred enough. I've seen Marco Sfoli playing on a vintage, well, not an actual vintage, but a custom shop Fender, which would be 9.5 inch radius too, and he doesn't seem to struggle with it. I think there is definite stuff to think about in this, because like one of my favourite players, Eric Johnson, I think one of the things that he used to do with his vintage strats would be to re-radius the fretboards, and so like his signature Eric Johnson strat is like 12 inches, but with a slightly chunkier neck, and that's a really interesting sort of feeling. But I would say, yeah, if you've read lots of stuff about vintage radius always being kind of tricky or inferior, for some people for sure, and fill up the comments and let people know your preferences. I was just chatting to someone this week who was asking about the Tokai. Was it Rob? I think it was Rob. And he was saying like he'd had I think a 9.5 inch radius on a Fender and didn't get on with it. But again, it might have been the smaller frets for him as well that were part of it. Just to me, what I found is that if I get on with the guitar, it's almost irrelevant what the radius is. And I think John Mayer does really have a kind of a point on that. Like, I've got guitars that are, I guess, 12 inch, like the Les Paul, 10 inch, my K-Line, 9.5 Fender Custom Shops. I've got other strats that are like this one. This is 7.25 inch radius. I think setup and size of frets. So this trem is moving. And I guess part of it will 100% come down to getting used to what you're used to. But for me, you know, I occasionally do a little bit of fast-ish playing. I don't feel like the vintage radius holds me back in that regard at all. And when I switch to slightly faster, more modern radiuses, like the 16-inch one, to me, like the lower the action gets and the flatter that radius gets, I feel like I struggle with that a bit more than maybe some people might expect. And it's kind of a little bit of the opposite of what the online kind of wisdom seems to be around this. But no, let me know your thoughts in the comments. Cheers for stopping by.